Remedy has stated in interviews that when they are making a new game, their hope is to make something that will become a part of pop culture. They saw this with their first big success with Max Payne. They were a small studio making a AAA game that would blend Hong Kong action with noir storytelling. Since the studio did not have a lot of excess funds, they had to get creative in how they delivered their narrative. This is where the comic panel cutscenes were born from, along with many voice actors being the developers or even friends and family of them. Remedy established themselves as a very talented team that could deliver memorable experiences. Max Payne 1 and 2 showed that the studio masterfully knew how to blend cinematic action with a good story. For their next game, they wanted to do something completely different. The success of the Max Payne games put the studio in a really good position to really dive into where they wanted to spend their time for their new game. This ended up being one of the best and underrated games that can be found on the Xbox 360 and PC. I present to you a look back at Alan Wake. As a result of Max Payne 2's success, Remedy was in a really good financial situation. This allowed them the freedom to really take their time to figure out what direction they wanted to go in for their new game. After spending 7 years making both Max Payne 1 and 2, Remedy was interested in doing something completely different. This resulted in the studio taking over a year to conceptualize different ideas for their next project. They look at this time as an exploration period where many game ideas were brought up, resulting in some being left behind. Essentially, Remedy wanted to show that they could deliver on something completely new to their audience. One concept was to have the studio pivot sharply from a noir action game to potentially focusing on a fantasy game with lots of humor. Oddly enough, this is where they started to explore with the idea of light and dark as a mechanic, and ended up taking this idea forward for their next game. Other ideas was a post-apocalyptic road trip game that would cover a journey from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Another game idea had the use of a small town, which was another element that would be used in their future project. This phase allowed the developers to really explore ideas and use that as a means to find elements for their game. Both of the Max Payne games were very linear, and Remedy wanted to play around with providing a free-roaming open world for their next project. The story was going to feature dreamlike elements, and this helped the studio find the name of the game along with the main protagonist. This is how the name Alan Wake was born. Alan Wake had a long pre-production period. Remedy had a lot of ambitious ideas, and it took them a lot of time to figure out how to make them all work together, along with this being their first open world game. And in some cases, Remedy found out that some elements needed to be tweaked, changed, or outright removed to ensure a better game. Within the open world setting, the player would need to prepare for nightfall. This would involve searching for portable light sources, gasoline for generators, and setting up camp to survive the night. Before deciding on the setting of Alan Wake, there were two other abandoned versions of it. One featured a volcano erupting and the whole area needing to be evacuated, and another was a more post-apocalyptic, where Alan Wake wakes up in a cabin and the darkness has already taken over the world. Both of these ideas were dropped for a more normal world setting with supernatural elements. Remedy decided to set their game in the Pacific Northwest. The art team took several trips there collecting information for their visual designs. It is important to note that this small studio of about 50 people were not using a licensed game engine, but rather making everything from the ground up. Also, Remedy found a publisher for Alan Wake with Microsoft, and their game would become an Xbox 360 exclusive. With there being a lot of ideas being thrown around and explored, it got to the point where Remedy was missing deadlines and struggling to really unify the gameplay and the narrative. As such, they formed a team with all the heads from their studio that would go through the project and figure out what to keep and what needed to be abandoned or changed to focus up the project. The team team was making really hard choices for the betterment of the game. Many of the core elements from the final project came from this process of giving their game a hard review and determining what needed to be done to make the best game. For example, enemies having a darkness shield that the player would need to burn away with a flashlight came from this. As a part of this, the studio made the hard decision to scrap the idea of an open world type game into something more linear. With the narrative being focused on being an action thriller, the open world nature of the gameplay made it very difficult to have that gel with what they were trying to do with the story. Remedy wanted the narrative to be a heart-pounding thrill ride. This meant that the developers wanted to control the pacing along with the foreshadowing. These elements ended up not working well within an open world setting. The change from open world to a linear adventure was about focusing up the game to really provide a tightly crafted experience. Remedy then looked at the foundation that they had built with their open world and crafted a path through it to make the levels for a linear adventure. This took a few months for the studio to refocus their efforts, but after this, the team had a stronger focus on what they wanted to build. Alan Wake's story took its inspirations from the writings of Stephen King, filmmakers like David Lynch and Alfred Hitchcock, along with the TV show Twin Peaks. As such, Remedy wanted to model their game into a season of a TV show, with each level being an episode, with their own conclusion, and then recapping the prior events in the next one. When it came to the character of Alan Wake, the writer of the game wanted him to not be an action hero like their prior protagonist. They wanted the game to be an action game, but have a character who was not at home with the action itself. Alan Wake would be a writer and an everyman. Remedy wanted some traditional horror elements within their narrative, but they did not want to present a lot of blood like you would see in a B movie. The story would be more focused on its mystery. Alan would be a character with flaws and problems within his life to make him relatable. He would be a character who would eventually grow into a hero. Remedy wanted to use several different means of storytelling to convey their narrative. There would be the main method, which would consist of many cutscenes. The story would be presented during gameplay along through the manuscript pages that the player would find. Then there would be pieces of optional story to find if the player wanted to. This would include local radio shows, a TV show that is inspired by the Twilight Zone, along with live action parts. The goal was to make the story in town feel like a living and breathing place. When it came to the combat, Remedy wanted the light and dark mechanics that they toyed around with in early development to be at the forefront within the game. This started with the player using a flashlight to defeat their enemies, but this evolved into combining the use of the flashlight with a gun. Remedy felt that the combination of using light and firearms brought great variety to the action. The light and gun allowed for dynamic exchanges with the enemies. This also allowed for more tension to come from the combat, as the player would need to keep an eye on both their battery level along with the amount of ammo that they had. Basically, the player would use the light to burn away the darkness on an enemy and then use their gun to actually defeat them. Combat would also highlight moments of success along with close calls where the player was almost hit. During these parts, the game will slow down and highlight these achievements. There would be a variety of enemies that the player would face, but one was born from an interesting discovery. The team found that some objects would cause damage to the player when they touched them. The team found these physics-based bugs, and instead of removing them, they used them as a means to create poltergeist enemies that would damage the player when they came into contact with the possessed object. It was a creative solution to a problem that ended up with a new foe that fit the setting for their game. Alan Wake was a very ambitious project for a 50-person studio. They opted to build a new engine for this game because all other engines on the market did not provide them with the detail and options that they needed to see their vision through. While the open world elements seemed interesting and would be a huge departure from their prior games, the ultimate decision to focus on Alan Wake being a linear game was made for the benefit of the project. Remedy felt that something was off when it came to the story and the open world gameplay. They were not gelling together, but rather working against each other. The studio was able to take a step back and self-reflect on what works best for the project, and refocus their efforts to make a better game, and this takes an incredible amount of talent to do so. Remedy has stated in several interviews that the reason the game took so long to make was because it was both a labor of love along with the studio's commitment to make a masterpiece. Remedy was known as a studio who respected their audience, and they wanted to provide them with a high-quality piece of entertainment that they had not experienced before. In May 2010, Alan Wake was released to the world. Alan Wake is a third-person shooter that combines simple-to-understand flashy combat with an engaging story, characters, and world that completely immerses you in the experience. The core shooting gameplay is simply great as the game takes what you would expect from a third-person shooter and mixes in the unique light mechanics from this universe. Alan Wake mixes in several different elements like survival horror, stylized action, and the supernatural with great success. There are some moments for exploration by finding additional supplies, but for the most part, this is a focused linear single-player game with a large attention on its narrative. This game seems masterfully balanced between delivering new story moments and providing large chunks of rewarding gameplay. This creates a compelling flow to the experience that effectively makes Alan Wake the equivalent of a page-turner. Alan Wake shows how Remedy is highly skilled in their craft, and this results in a very unique and awesome experience.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end. My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
You're dead, just like...
Alan Wake is a third-person shooter with an interesting twist with its light and dark mechanics. Generally, the enemies that you will fight will be covered in darkness. You cannot damage them with your guns while they are in this state. You need to burn away the darkness so that you can land your shots. This is where the flashlight comes into play. You can choose to aim at an enemy and the darkness will slowly burn away, as represented by the circle on the enemy. If you choose to shine your flashlight directly at someone, this will drain your battery, but the trade-off is that the darkness gets burned away quicker. You can even refill your battery if you need to maintain using your flashlight in this manner. Once the darkness is removed, you can use your firearms to finally defeat your foes. Shooting your firearms is a bit different in this game as you won't need to worry about going for headshots. Instead, you only need to worry about landing a few hits anywhere on the enemy to kill them. The light and dark mechanic layered onto the shooting creates compelling encounters. It is a very simple system that makes for engaging combat. During each of the encounters, your first priority will be to figure out what your opposition is, and determine how you will take them out before they try and hurt you. Some enemies move really fast, others will move slowly towards you, while others have a charging state that you need to look out for. Remedy likes to have a lot of fun by providing different situations for the player to experience along with memorable set pieces. Sometimes there will be explosive barrels or even additional lights that you can use to outright kill enemies instantly, or remove their darkness altogether. This light and dark mechanic feeds into your arsenal as well. You do get a handful of firearms like a pistol, 2 different shotguns, and a hunting rifle, but 2 of the most valuable and deadly weapons are the flare gun and the flashbang grenades. The flare gun is essentially this game's version of a rocket launcher as it will instantly kill many enemies and leave some light in the area. The flashbangs will also kill most enemies and can be great to use when you're surrounded. Now, since this is a Remedy game, there is a large amount of stylization and cinematic presentation to the action. The guns have great sound effects along with solid feedback and impact to them. Defeated enemies will vaporize into bits of light, and you will know when you have killed the last enemy in a group because this will cause the game to go into slow-mo. Many times while using the flare gun, the game will slow everything down so it can glorify the weapon's effects. This also extends to the defensive options. You can hold flares as a means to ward off oncoming enemies, and it can be used in conjunction with the flashlight to remove the darkness quicker. Alan also has a dodge at his disposal. If you can get your timing right, you can avoid many of the attacks that are thrown at you. Many of these successful dodges are highlighted by the game going into slow-mo to show how the player was almost hit. Alan Wake is very much a game that has simple yet excellent combat that is enhanced by its cinematic presentation. Most of the combat encounters will have you trying to manage many different foes at once. There is a pretty good amount of enemy variety here. You have your normal foot soldiers, quicker enemies, larger ones, poltergeists, and crows that can only be defeated by using light against them. Some enemies will throw various blades at you as well. The AI is pretty good and will take every opportunity to try and flank you. If you have 5 enemies coming at you, they will try and branch off to your left and right to catch you off guard. What can make the combat situations challenging are when the crows and poltergeists are mixed in with the foot soldiers. This is where you will be making quick decisions to run away to a better position to handle your threat. Or maybe you drop a flare and opt to focus on the flying enemies first before contending with the foot soldiers. And in some situations, it might even be appropriate to try and run away from your threat altogether and find safety. Light is the main means to gain your health back along with checkpointing the game. Running towards a checkpoint or creating one can be really intense and provide you with that reprieve once you are safe. The combat has some nice details that you can use to help yourself manage the enemies. For example, when you shine your flashlight directly at an enemy, this will usually stun them for a few seconds. Alan will slightly turn his head in the direction of where the enemies are coming from off screen. This gives you a subtle indication if you have anyone who is trying to flank you. This game shows more of its survival horror side at times by how it changes up the action so that the player doesn't get too comfortable. There are a few spots where you don't have any gun to use and you have to only use a flashlight, a few flares, or maybe some flashbangs. By not having a gun, this really limits your options, but in those limitations, it enhances the tension. Since Alan Wake takes place in a small town out in the middle of nowhere, it really takes advantage of that setting and creates environments that are varied and creepy at times that provide natural tension. The game really plays up exploring a forest at night. The sound effects mixed with the density of trees and the visual darkness creates an unsettling feeling. And a lot of this is owed to the well done fog effects as well. The adventure will take you through a town under attack by the darkness, a lumber mill, a farm, a mental facility with its own hedge maze, and many more locations. Remedy is really great at delivering quality set pieces. One of the most memorable ones is where you are fighting on a concert stage with the music playing in the background and the stage lights assisting you in the fight. The developers take some of the typical hold your ground objectives and adds a lot of style and presentation to the set pieces. Some even have you focus on running through an area as fast as possible before a dark force can catch up with you. Alan Wake even has its own play on turret sections where you control a large light and can completely obliterate most enemies. Something that I found to be true in Remedy's Max Payne games and in Alan Wake is how I found the combat to be very addictive. Their unique ability to make both the shooting feel satisfying and be presented at a high level is really what sells it, along with how in Alan Wake you have this simple yet interesting light and dark mechanic. Burning away the darkness from an enemy never gets boring and it's always enjoyable to do. Now while Alan Wake is a very linear game, it does provide its environments with a lot of density which rewards the player for exploring a little. Hidden supplies can be found giving you a leg up on your next encounter, and others are more story oriented that help to bring character and personality to the place itself along with the side characters. Some levels even allow you to drive a car, which is useful for its light power against enemies, and you can ram them with your car to make quick work of them. The driving is not the tightest and could be a bit better, since it can feel just a bit too loose. There are a few instances of platforming, and while the variety is appreciated, this is easily one of the weakest areas of the game. A few spots require some precision jumping, and you can easily miss your target and die. I want to pivot back to the combat since Alan Wake introduces some new mechanics within episode 6 that are used a lot in the final 2 episodes after this. At this point in the game, the player can use their flashlight on words presented in the air. This will cause different things to either spawn into the environment like supplies or even assets to help out the player. My favorite of these are the instances where you can use them to outright kill your enemies. For example, some words when highlighted will cause an outright light explosion, or it will spawn in some explosive barrels. There is a really fun sequence while in a basement where you can turn on different furnaces to hit the enemies with flames. Highlighting the words to hurt your foes is really fun and fits the game and rewards the player for lining up the enemies and hitting them just right. The best situation of using the words is when you need to go through a large field and you need to really watch out where you're pointing your flashlight onto, because you can accidentally spawn in some enemies. This is one of the few situations where the flashlight can actually hinder you if you don't use it correctly, and I like how the game played with that aspect of it. From a gameplay side of things, Alan Wake is simple, flashy, intense, and very enjoyable.
I've always had a vivid imagination, but this dream unsettled me. It was wild and dark and weird, even by my standards. So yes, it began with a dream. Following a typical nightmare pattern, I was late, desperately trying to reach my destination, a lighthouse. For some urgent reason, I couldn't remember. I'd been driving too fast down a coastal road to get there. I'd seen the hitchhiker too late. He was dead. I was convinced they'd put me in jail and I would never see Alice again.
The story within Alan Wake is easily one of the best aspects about the game. The narrative takes its inspiration from different novels, movies, and TV shows and creates something new, fresh, and captivating. Just like with their prior efforts with Max Payne 1 and 2, they create a protagonist here, who is someone that the player can root for and is engaging to be around because they are flawed. Alan is a reluctant hero, and I love seeing his characterization and development throughout the story. He is a famous writer and doesn't always treat the people closest to him the best. The best examples of this is with his wife. Within the first chapter and in some of the flashbacks, there are instances where he blows up at his wife and they are not really justified. This stuff really sets up Alan as a rather unlikable character, but once his wife is missing, it launches Alan into an adventure to go and find and rescue his wife. This is all done within the first episode, as the story shows some of Alan's worst sides and selfish ways, while also getting the player to understand him and want to participate in helping him save his wife. There's even some moments later in the game where we see Alan taking the delight of someone who he despises. Dr. Hartman is only interested in furthering himself and using others. There's a moment where Alan blocks the door so that Hartman can't escape, and it really doesn't show the best side of Alan, but it is one that we can understand and even enjoy in seeing as well. On the flip side, the narrative is full of moments where we see Alan trying to be a hero by doing the right thing. The best example of this is how, without any hesitation, once he hears Alice scream, he rushes back to the cabin to find her, along with jumping into the lake to attempt a rescue. While he may not always treat her the best, his devotion to her is admirable. In episode 2, we see Alan try to rescue the cabin owner who is being attacked by the Taken. One of my favorite parts from the story is how Alan stops his quest to find Alice when he learns that his best friend Barry and Sheriff Baker are in danger. Both of these characters help Alan out before, and Alan's zero hesitation to attempt a rescue shows how much they mean to him, and even if it means it might delay Alice's rescue. I really love these moments since it shows how this selfish man is actually a good man and selfless when the chips are down. Experiencing an established flawed character rise above many of his flaws makes him a protagonist I love. There's a great small moment in the final episode where Alan is being very critical of himself, along with his actions before the start of the game. It really shows how far Alan has come to this point in the story, and how he wants to continue to keep doing better. There are many excellent moments about the story, but I think the story works so well because of the well done execution of Alan's character. Alan is someone we can emotionally get behind. So when the game is ambiguous or even confusing, Alan's character grounds the narrative and provides us with that emotional weight. What feeds into this is the great execution of Alice. The story has a hard task of introducing Alice, establishing her as someone that the player likes, along with providing justification as to why Alan cares about her so much. This way we understand Alan's motivations, and we as the player want to save Alice as well. Before she is taken, we see examples of Alice trying to help Alan, along with the both of them having some cute chemistry. Some of the later flashbacks help to reinforce why Alan is doing what he is doing, and keeping that motivation at the forefront for the player. The side characters are just as compelling as well. Barry is the perfect side character. He is the comic relief, always backing up Alan. He provides some of the best laughs. I really love how Barry and Alan joke with each other, just like longtime friends would do.
Something to say. What's that, Al?
Ooh, I'm Alan Wake. I'm always right about everything. And if I don't get my way, I'll sulk all day long. I'm always intense and moody. It makes me very attractive and mysterious. Right now, I'm just standing here because I need my best friend Barry to carry me. But that's okay. I can just take him for granted.
I think I see what you did there.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
You want me to do my imitation of Barry Wheeler? No? Thought so.
You didn't like that one? A tough audience. Well, I got plenty more.
What are the Christmas lights for?
Protection, man! Like garlic against vampires?
Vampires.
The helicopter. The Bright Falls General Store is now my favorite place in the entire world. See this headlamp? It's like a superpower. I can just look at one of those things and they die. It's my flaming eye of Mordor. I wish I didn't say that.
Yeah.
Hey, I want a headlamp.
The story does a good job with establishing the wealth of different characters you will meet within Bright Springs. This helps to make Bright Springs feel like an actual place. We see this through the use of the radios, which you can find and listen to the local radio show with Pat Maine. The voice actor for this is perfect, and I listen to each one of these every time I replay the game. They give you some insight on the town folks or their reactions to the odd stuff going on. This is additional story content that can be easily skipped, but for those that want it, it only adds texture to the town. TVs can be turned on to watch these mini episodes of the game's version of the Twilight Zone. These are really entertaining and make you think how the entire story of Alan Wake could be a Twilight Zone episode. Another collectible that factors into the story are the manuscript pages that the player will find. Since the game consists of Alan experiencing a novel that he does not remember writing coming to life, the player will find pages scattered throughout the levels. These will provide you with additional information detailing later events, describing events that are happening at the same time but in a different location, and many more. Essentially, these things act as a form of an audio log, but they are shortened to the point and narrated very well. Alan Wake does a great job of establishing its mystery, along with finding new ways to keep the mystery fresh until the very end of the game, along with providing the player with just enough answers and context to keep them hooked. Many parts of the game are kept ambiguous on purpose, and while that can be a bit frustrating, since we want to fully understand everything that is going on, but I also like this since it keeps us engaged thinking about where the narrative can go next. And like I said before, since Alan's character is well done and grounds the narrative, it means that we can understand the motivation and are emotionally invested in this crazy supernatural adventure. The story likes to play with the player from a psychological perspective with a few red herrings where we start to doubt if all of this supernatural stuff is actually happening or if it's all in Alan's head. One of my favorite parts in the narrative are the final 2 episodes. It is here that Alan has rescued Alice, but he is trapped in the dark place. These 2 episodes center around Alan trying to gain back control of his mind. So this allows the developers to use earlier levels and twist and change them to reflect Alan's current mental state. We see twisted versions of established characters along with new areas mixed in with altered old ones. Before we close this section, I need to praise the storytelling presented to the player. The game uses many different means to convey the narrative. This means that at all times the player is involved with the story on some level. The short but well done cutscenes provides the highest level of presentation with the story, where the radios, TVs, and manuscripts act like these small bits of narrative that help to provide more mystery and texture to the narrative. And as expected with a Remedy game, the gameplay is full of enjoyable story-focused moments that are all player-controlled. There's a lot of effort to both create a believable setting and world within this engaging supernatural mystery. I also like the small touches to give off the impression that we are playing a season of a TV show, with each level being an episode and closing out with a licensed song during the credits, and then having each episode then begin with a recap of the prior events. There is a part of me that would have loved to see this game released weekly with new episodes arriving once a week for 8 weeks. I wonder how that would have been received. Alan Wake does have similar elements to other pieces of entertainment, but the talent is always in the execution and it is masterfully done here. I find this to be a close to perfect game, and there are a few areas that I would improve on. The jumping and few platforming sections are really clunky because of the imprecise controls in this area. The driving is not as bad, but it is an area that could benefit from more refinement. Another thing you will notice is how the lip syncing can be a bit off at times during the cutscenes. There is one instance in the mental facility where you need to use a poltergeist to hit a door so that you can escape. It requires some light problem solving and using an enemy's attack to your advantage. I wish that there were more instances of this type of stuff in the game. While there is a decent variety in the different enemies and weapons that you can use, this is definitely an area that could have used a few more options. For example, there is only one pistol in the game and I wish that there was a few more. Thankfully, this is addressed very well in the follow-up title American Nightmare, where the enemy variety is greatly improved, along with Alan's arsenal. This last area I want to mention is more of a comment rather than a flaw on the game. When this game was initially released, the last 2 episodes were sold separately as DLC on the Xbox. This feels like it was a Microsoft decision, since these last 2 DLCs are actually the true ending to the game. Thankfully, when this was released on PC, everything was included in one package. Alan Wake does have some issues here and there, there, but nothing that ever really breaks the immersion and truly ruins this excellent execution of a game. Before we move to the conclusion, I need to praise the soundtrack. The music is fantastic here, with great tracks backing up the emotional moments and others that enhance the action on screen. Here are a few tracks from the game. Alan Wake is Remedy's underrated masterpiece. While this game was received well critically and most people who played it really enjoyed it, it did not sell well enough at the time. I think part of this is it released very close to other big titles. This resulted in Alan Wake becoming a cult classic of sorts, and slowly growing its loyal audience, and even more so when it was released on PC. Given that this game is 10 years old now, it really impresses how the audience of Alan Wake has only grown, really showing the lasting power to this game. Remedy has given a lot of faith to its audience that it hasn't abandoned Alan Wake either. They do want to make a sequel. Following Alan Wake, we got an excellent adventure with American Nightmare, along with Alan Wake getting his own DLC in their game Control. I absolutely love this game, from the gameplay to the story. This is a great example of a studio combining different elements to create something unique and incredibly rewarding to experience. The concept and execution of the mystery and supernatural elements is great, but what makes Alan Wake really work for me is Alan himself. He is such an engaging protagonist and made more interesting with his flaws. The combat is another area that I cannot get enough of. The shooting mixed with the light and dark mechanics is endlessly entertaining, and I only want more of it. Alan Wake is a truly special experience. I hope that Remedy gets the opportunity to make a sequel and properly conclude this story. I highly recommend playing this game, and thank you very much for watching.